Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all here today for what promises to be a really interesting talk on a very difficult subject, which is sexual violence during armed conflict and the representations of that and the recovery from that. My name is Clint Curl, and I'm head of stakeholder relations at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. The main goal of our museum, which is set to open next year, is to promote understanding and dialogue and reflection on human rights themes. And one of the best ways to do that is to do things like this, where we gather together and we share our experiences, and we share our research, and we tell our stories, and we listen to each other and we learn from each other. We're very pleased to be partnering with the University of Manitoba's Centre for Human Rights Research in this endeavor this afternoon. Today we're very honored to have one of the last surviving victims of military sexual slavery during the Second World War. Lola Fidencia David, age 85, is being accompanied here to Winnipeg from the Philippines by Cristina Lope Rosello, a Filipino therapist who helps former comfort women deal with the trauma of their past. Cristina's recent book called Disconnect, the Filipino Comfort Women traces the human impact of 50 years of post-war silence about girls who were abducted and sexually enslaved by the Japanese military in so-called comfort stations. And in fact, Cristina was at the center of the advocacy at the International Criminal Court to criminalize wartime rape and other gender-based violations under the Rome Statute. We're also very honored to have Joyce Chadya, who's an expert in Zimbabwean history, and she'll be talking about sexual abuse and sexual violation during the Zimbabwean War. In fact, when we were just preparing introductions, we didn't know what term to use, so we went with sexual abuse, but Joyce will explain further the nuance around those terms. We also are honored to have our own Chen, who's going to be presenting current knowledge of comfort women in China. So the order of events will be as follows. We'll begin with Lola Fidencia, who will just tell a little bit of her story. And she'll be translated. She speaks in Tagalog, but she'll be translated by Cristina. And then that will be followed by Cristina, who will be presenting a little bit of her work as a psychotherapist, helping victims recover from trauma. And then we'll have Joyce come forward and present her research on the Zimbabwean War. And that'll be followed by Tina, who will be presenting her paper on knowledge of comfort women in China. And then Tina will then serve as our moderator for question and answer time. So with that, I'd like to invite forward my grandmother Fidencia and Cristina.
Magandang umaga po sa inyo lahat. Nagpapasalamat ako sapagkat ako po ay naimbita dito sa ating pagpupulong.
Good afternoon. She said good morning, but good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for having been invited here to this gathering today.
Noong 1942, dumating po yung mga Japanese doon sa aming bayan, sa Dasupang Basilan.
It was in 1942 that the Japanese invaded my country and eventually my hometown of Dasol, Pangasinan.
Pagkatapos po, ang sabi po yung mga tao sa baryo, kailangan gumawa daw ng tunnel para kung pupunta man yung mga Japanese doon sa baryo, mayroon na kami pong pagkataguan. Yung tunnel na ginawa yung aking father, linagyan niya ng bubong yung dayami, tapos yung dahon-dahon ng mga kahoy.
Okay, when Japanese presence was detected, the people in my barrio thought of building tunnels where we can all hide. My father built one, and he used leaves to cover the entrance so we will not be seen from the inside.
Pagkatapos po, lumipas ng mga ilang araw, umakyat na po yung mga Hapon doon sa aming baryo para kumuha sila ng mga pagkain nila. Kumuha po sila ng mga prutas, mga manok, mga lahat po yung Fix it abay, ginawa nila. Pagkatapos po, nung nakita nila na wala na ang tao, ang ginawa nila, sinunog po yung aming bahay.
After several days, the Japanese arrived in our barrio, and they took all the fruits and the vegetables and the chickens from our house. And noticing that no one was home, they also burned down the house.
Pagkatapos po, nung sila umalis, ang sabi po yung aking tatay, gumawa daw kami ng maliit na kubo-kubo para kami po ay magpagtiraan.
So when the invaders had left, my father put up a makeshift kubo hut where the family can live in.
Pagkatapos, lumipas ng mga ilang araw, ang sabi ko yung aking lola, kailangan magtinda ka ta, kunin natin yung mga prutas natin, lahat ng produkto, para dalhin natin sa bayan.
Actually, she lives with her grandmother because she was orphan. Anyway, after several days, her grandmother told her that they should gather all the remaining fruits and vegetables and sell this in the town proper so that they can buy their own provisions.
Pagkatapos po, nung kami po'y malapit na dun sa palengke, nakita po kami yung makapili na bodyguard yung mga hapon dahil ako ng bilao. Pagkatapos, sabi niya, pinipituan ako. Ngayon dahil natatakot ako. Pagkatapos, ang sabi yung makapili, gusto mo bang pugutin ko ang ulo mo? Umiyak ako.
Okay. She was carrying the vegetables and fruits on her head using a native basket. When they arrived close to the marketplace, a makapili was a Filipino-Japanese collaborator. Approached her because the Japanese was using a whistle to call her, to summon her, but she didn't listen. So the Japanese collaborator, the Filipino, approached her and said, "Why are you not heeding the call? Do you want us to cut your head off?"
Pagkatapos po, ang aking lola, naghiwalay kami. Ako ang sumama doon sa mga makapili at saka yung Japanese. Pagkatapos po, nung nandun ako, ibinaba yung aking bilao. Pagkatapos, sinampal ako.
Okay, she and her grandmother digressed. Her grandmother was forced to take another route, and she was the one who was taken by the collaborator to the Japanese. And when she was already in front of the soldier, she was slapped on both cheeks.
Pagkatapos po, inutusan yung Japanese, yung makapili na kumuha ng tubig na ipapainom sa akin. Nung hindi ko po mainom yung tubig na yun, pinutos ko sa akin.
The Japanese told the collaborator to get a bucket of water, and he forced her to drink the water. She didn't finish any, she just drank a little bit. So out of anger, the remaining water was poured on her head, and she cried again.
Pagkatapos po, nung umiiyak ako, sumisigaw ako, dumating yung aming lola. Pagsabi niya, baka pwede nyo nang pakawalan ng aming ako. Nagalit din po, yung Japanese, kinugot yung hunting knife, tapos, hiniwa yung chicken.
When she was crying, her grandmother approached and pleaded to the Japanese to let her granddaughter go. But this further angered the Japanese. He took out a hunting knife and slashed her ear.
Sigaw ako, umiiyak ako. Ngayon, ang sabi yung Japanese, inutusan niya yung makapili na kumuha ng tali, yung akong kamay, at saka yung akong lola. Tinula doon sa gitna ng araw.
Okay, so the Japanese ordered the makapili collaborator to tie her hands at the back as well as those of her grandmother, and they were dragged to actually it was the plaza, and they joined other prisoners and they were exposed to the scorching heat of the sun.
Katapos po, yung mataas na ng araw, tanghali na, pinakawalan yung tali namin, pinasok kami doon sa garrison. At doon po kami nagluluto, naglalaba, naglilinis lahat sa buong paligid.
later in the day, they were um, forced to go to the garrison. Actually, it was a municipal hall which was occupied and transformed into a garrison. They were made to do chores, cleaning, washing, and all the other chores for the invaders.
Katapos po, nagluluto kami ng pagkain nila. Pag natapos na po yung pagluluto namin, gabi na yun, pinapasok po ako dun sa isang kwarto. Ngayon po, nabutan ko na merong 4 na babae. Pinaupo ako sa tabi. Pagkatapos, lumipas ng mga ilang oras, pumasok na po yung 3 hapon. Pagkatapos, nung nakita po ako yung hapon, hinapitan niya ako, hinawak-hawakan yung aking mukha. Dahil ako po'y takot na takot. Hinagyakan ko siya ganyan. Pagkatapos, kinuha yung panyo, pinalik ko doon sa aking bibig. Nung natalian niya ako, pinunton niya po ako ganyan. Doon na po ako nawala ng mga ngalat. Doon na po ako rin. Kailan ang pagsabit ko para sa akin. Dahil inusinti ako noon. Pagkatapos po, kinumagahan, ganun din ang ginagawa nila sa loob ng 10 araw kami nakakulong doon. Lumipas po ng mga ilang araw, bumalik ulit yung mga hapon doon sa amin para kukuha ulit ng pagkain. Nung pumunta sila sa amin, nakita nila yung 2 gerilya na nakituloy doon sa amin. Kaya,
Okay, in the evening, after preparing for the food for the Japanese, she was brought to a room where she saw 4 other women. And she was made to sit in one corner. And soon thereafter, 3 Japanese soldiers entered the room. One went to her and started touching her in the face, fondling her. And since she was not used to it, she cried and she kicked him real hard. And in retaliation, he gagged her mouth with a piece of cloth and also pushed her head against the wall, which made her lose her consciousness. And that's when she was raped. In the next few days, the same thing happened. Japanese soldiers would take turns in raping her in the evenings. This lasted for 10 days. After 10 days, she and her grandmother were released, not really released, but were made to accompany the soldiers who were going back to her barrio to get more food. And on the way to the barrio, they stopped by a house which is also used by the Japanese soldiers. And they stayed overnight, and it was in that instance that she saw that her grandmother was raped. The next day, they proceeded to the barrio, and the Japanese saw the Filipino guerrilla workers, Filipino guerrilla fighters have occupied her barrio. So they were brought there supposedly to serve as shields for the Japanese soldiers.
Katapos po, nung sumunod yung mga Japanese doon sa amin, ang sabi yung guerrilla, Alto! Alto la punyita! Sabi yung guerrilla. Pagkatapos po nagalit yung Japanese, dinaril niya yung aking lola. Pagkatapos po, nung dinaril yung lola ko, nagka-barilan na lahat sila. Namatay na po yung 2 guerrilla. Ngayon, ako naman po, tumakbo ako dun sa bukid para magtago. Pero sinundan pa rin ako yung isang Japanese at doon pa rin niya ako. Kaya,
Okay, nearing the barrio, the guerrilla fighters were able to shoot the Japanese, and their leader immediately died. Out of anger, the invaders shot her grandmother as retaliation. She ran to the rice fields, but one of the soldiers followed her and raped her there. And she also mentioned that in the exchange of gunfire, the guerrilla workers were out-armed and were killed.
katapos, nung natapos na po yung Japanese, kinuha nila yung 2 billion na nakata at umalis na po sila. Tapos, nung makita yung aking tatay, ng aking lola ay patay, umiyak po yung aking tatay kahit namatay na yung nanay niya. Pagkatapos, hanapin po niya ako. Nakita niya po ako doon sa palayan na nakahiga at umiiyak ako.
When the fighting subsided, her father saw the cadaver. No, when the fighting subsided, the Japanese invaders took the cadavers of the guerrilla fighters with them, and then her father surfaced and saw that her mother, the dead body of her grandmother, and he cried because his mother, her grandmother, had died. And then he looked further on and found her in the rice field. She was just lying there, quietly sobbing.
Katapos po yun, kinuha ng tatay ko, yung lola ko, tapos hinanak nga niya ako. Kung nakita niya ako, pinatasin po kami ko sa aming tututulog. Pagkatapos, lumipas na ng ilang araw, tapos, siguro po mayroon mga 1 buwan na binabalik-balik na nila kami dun sa baryo. Pero yung mga tatay ko, nagtatago na po doon sa ginawa ng tangay. Ako na lamang po ang naiiwan mo sa bahay. Pag tumarating pa yung mga hapon, pa rin po ako kaya. Masakit po ba sa akin?
She said that after the incident, the Japanese would still come over to her barrio in search of food, and all the men in the barrio would go into hiding. But she remained in the house. But every time she sees them, all the sense of terror goes back. You know, she re-experiences the terror that she had experienced.
Katapos po, lumipas na yun, hindi na po sila nagbalik. Siguro, lumipat na po sila sa ibang lugar. Pero ako, masakit para sa akin na ginawa yung mga po. Kaya hanggang ngayon po, humihingi kami ng katarungan. Dahil hanggang ngayon po, hindi pa naman nila kaming binibigyan. 22 taon na ang aming po pinaglalaban. Wala pa rin po liwanag. Kaya, ang sabi namin, bakit naman ganyan? Bakit sa ibang puportuhan? Dinidig nila ang kanilang mga nakaraan na kwento. Bakit dito sa Pilipinas? Pupunta naman po kami sa Kongreso. Sinasabi po namin yung hindi naman po nila binibigyan ng aksyon. Kaya, ano ba ang nangyari po sa amin? At wala man lang nilang binibigay na mapulot. Kaya iyan po ang aming hinihiling sa Japanese na sana bigyan kami ng apology para naman yung aming masakit na ginawa nila sa amin. Mapatawad namin sila pero wala. Lahat po ng mga lula na kasama ko, namatay na po lahat. Wala man lang po sinabi na, wala. Kaya, ang sabi namin, bakit ganyan? Bakit sa ibang mga pumportuman? Dinididik nila yung kanilang reklamo. Bakit dito sa Pilipinas? Maging po ang mga aming mga congressman, mga senador, lalo na po kay President Gloria makapalararo yun. Nung siya po'y mga kandidato, sinuportahan namin para sa ganon, yung aming reklamo sa Japan, sana naman ayusin niya, pero wala. Natapos po siya ng Vice President, nung President, kinampanya din po namin. Natapos po ng President, wala na, sabi ko, aywan ko, hindi ko kayo kilala. Kaya napakasakit po sa amin. Bakit ganyan ang ginagawa yung mga gobyerno sa amin?
Okay, she said that they've been fighting for redress for the past 22 years, but nothing happened. Nothing came out of it. And she said that they're really hopefully looking forward to a formal apology from the Japanese state. So it can serve as a form of redress for all of them. But no apology has been issued. In fact, what happened to them has been denied. And the worst of it all is, from our own government, there is no support. Compared to the Korean government has been giving the Korean comfort women a lot of support and encouragement. But this is not obtaining in our country. And then she made mention of us going to Congress to lobby for a congressional resolution which will compel the Japanese state to issue a formal apology and to give individual compensation for all the victims. But again, there were many empty promises over several years, but nothing came out of it. Then she cites one of our former presidents, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, when she was running for the Senate. She promised to help them, and in return, they also campaigned for her. And when she ran for vice president, the same thing, she still promised to help them, and they also campaigned for her. Eventually, she became the president. When she became the president, and they were able to confront her, she denied them. She denied knowing them. So she's asking your help if you can also help in their fight for redress.
Sana po, ako po yung nag-uusap sa iyo na sana tulungan niyo kami ng mga komportuman dahil ubos na po ang mga komportuman. Ilang-ilang na lang kaming nabubuhay pero hindi pa rin namin na kami pagkatarungan.
She said, please help us in our fight for redress. Most of my colleagues have passed away. There's only a handful of us. I'm adding, there's only about 26 surviving comfort women in the Philippines out of the 167 who surfaced in the early 1990s. And you want to add you want your help?
Kaya nga, yun na nga po. Kaya nagpapasalamat po ako sapagkat ako po yung naimbitahan dito sa Canada at ma-share ko na naman ang aming istorya. Kaya yung mga tao na nag-imbita sa amin dito, maraming pong salamat sapagkat kung hindi po dahil sa inyo, hindi na naman po ako makarating dito.
She's thankful that she'd been invited, actually with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. She's thankful that she's been invited to this forum, that she's able to express herself and tell her story. She would end with a poem.
Ito po tula na ito. Ito po yung mayroong isang
Writer. There was a writer who wrote this poem.
Ngayon, itong tula to, bawat po isang komportuman, ini-interview kami. Yung mga nakuha niyang interview, yung writer na yun, pinadudugtong-dugtong niya. Pagkatapos nung natapos na yun, yung ginawa ng tula. Sa amin lahat, ako lamang po ang nakakuha itong tulang nito. Bawat bibig kasing tula, meron pong kahulugan, masakit para sa amin.
This poem was written by a writer during those early days when they just surfaced and they were individually interviewed. So the writer took snatches from each of the comfort women who were interviewed and made it into a composite poem so that every line has a special meaning for the survivors. She's the only survivor who memorized the poem, and so she will share it with you.
po ang tulad nito ay babae.
The title is Woman.
Babae. Gumamilang marikit. Puno ng pangarap at talino.
Gumamela, it's a flower, so full of hope and so talented.
Pagmamahal at ligaya.
Love and happiness.
Magsasaka. Ang gagawa. Ang mananong.
Farmer, worker, dressmaker,
Tindera.
store seller, nurse,
Katulong.
helper.
Nagsilbi. Nagtiis. Lumaki sa kahirapan.
They worked hard and, in poverty.
Ako ay babae.
I am a woman.
Dilim lang. Binugbog ng walang dahilan.
I was violated and transgressed against.
Pinusalan ng bibig. Biktima ng digmaan.
Or
Walang karahasan.
violence, victim of violence.
Bulaklak na naputo sa tangkay. Nalantang at nakadusay.
Like a flower cut off from the stem, it fell on the sideways, prostrate, lying prostrate.
Subalit, ako ay babae.
But I am a woman.
Taas nung matatag. Hindi nakatago.
I will raise my head, fearless.
Hindi sumusuko sa gitna ng pagsasamantala.
I will not surrender even in the face of violence.
Nagsikap, nagpatuloy, humarap sa katotohanan.
I persevered, I confronted my demons, I faced the harsh reality.
Naghanap ng kaligayahan.
I looked for happiness.
Namulat, nagising,
I was awakened. I was roused from sleep.
tumindig,
I stood up.
lumaban,
I fought
hanggang sa tagumpay ng katarungan.
and I will fight until justice is given.
Ipaglaban ang karapatan, ang mga kababaihan, lalong-lalo na sa mga comfort woman.
Let us fight for the rights of women and fight for the rights of the comfort women.
Marami pong salamat sa inyo. Sana po naiintindihan niyo po ang aking nangyari noong 2,500 Maraming pong salamat sa inyo. Sana po inaasahan po yung suportan niyo para makamit namin po ang katawan.
Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you, and I look forward to you helping us in our fight for redress. Thank you very much.
Marami pong salamat.
Okay, my talk is on the psychotherapy and the Filipino comfort women. The background of this is that after the end of the war, for 50 years, the comfort women experience was invisible. You know? It was only in 1991 that the first comfort woman appeared in the person of Kim Hak-soon from Korea. And there were several factors which brought women to surface. One was the experience of the Balkan women. You know, there was a sense of wanting to look back to past transgressions against women during the war. Second, there was a new global order. You know, the Cold War has just ended, so there was like human rights was emerging as a key and pivotal element in the new global order. Okay. So this is the outline of presentation. I'm only given 15 minutes, so we'll just go through the salient points. But you can look at the PowerPoint presentation. And if there's any questions you have, you can maybe ask me later. Historical background, wartime rape and enslavement, phenomenological existential psychotherapy, healing encounters, therapy as restorative justice. That complete healing, what is the resolution? Oh, sorry. Wait, how do you do this, guys? objectives, glimpse into the inner world, and the phenomenological existential psychotherapy approach, if it will interest you. But I'm willing to digress. You have other interests. Okay. The Philippines was taken, it was invaded on December 8, 1942, after the Pearl Harbor was bombed. Japanese planes from the Taiwanese base were already en route to the Philippines, bombing Clark Air Base, which is the base of the American forces, and Davao in Mindanao. At that time, the Philippines was a colony of the United States. So we were invaded partly because we were considered enemy territory. So with the sudden invasion of the Philippines, women were abducted. The girls witnessed brutal killing of family members, and they were dragged to makeshift camps in the battlefront. They were successively raped daily by soldiers, and they were forced to do chores for the enemy soldiers. In a study made by anthropologist Sarah Saw, she classified the Filipino comfort women experience as criminal in nature because it happened in the final stages of the war, and there was really fierce fighting. You know, they were violated to subjugate the guerrilla fighters who were ferocious fighters. Pre-war lives, they were relatively pristine communities. They were seen, chastity was upheld. And all of a sudden, bombs were dropped. Okay, the Comfort Women System, this refers to about 200 Asian women who were abducted and incarcerated by the Japanese military in so-called comfort stations. Comfort implies the sexual relief of the soldiers in the battlefield. This system was devised after the Nanjing invasion in 1937, where countless Chinese women were raped to the embarrassment of the Japanese government. And so military brothels will set up and logistical support was provided, including regular medical checkups for sexually transmitted diseases. By coming up with military brothels, they were able to provide relief for their soldiers, and secondly, prevented war secrets to leak out. Okay. Lola Fidencia and I belong to the Lola's Compañera Survivors Group. This is the third support group. There are 3 support groups in the Philippines. We all came from Manila, Filipina, but we have now moved to the third group. And of this third group, we have Lola Fidencia is the only one remaining in Metro Manila. And all the others are from Pampanga. Not in picture is the one in Rojas City in central Philippines. Of course, there's a little chubby lady there. She's not a comfort woman. That happens to be me. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, comfort stations first appeared in 1942, and they sprouted after the Nanjing massacre. And then in the 13th period that Japan was engaged in war, comfort stations were manifold and varied. The Filipino victimization is considered criminal criminal in nature. And these were the planes which were used. Remember, Lola was describing there were planes that they heard flying overhead. These were sample of the planes that were used in the Philippines. Okay. if you look at the context of the World War II, the Pacific War, it was a war among colonial powers, particularly Japan and the US. And women were pawns to obliterate the powers that be. The stories were concealed for 50 years, except for a handful of publications in Korea and Japan. Okay, so these are the sequence of events. In 1909, Kim Hak-sun appeared, followed by Rosa Henson, the first Filipino comfort woman who publicly came out. Then 11 January 92, there was an Asahi Shimbun article where the findings of Yoshimi Yoshiyami linked Japan's imperial government to military brothels. Before this, the Japanese government was denying the existence of comfort stations. The Asahi Shimbun article is pivotal because it was this expose which resulted to the Kono statement. Kono was a cabinet secretary, and he acknowledged the involvement of the Japanese military in comfort stations. Okay, so, breaking the 50-year silence. The Atonement. In August 1995, there was an Asian Women's Fund which came from private sources, but this could not be considered a form of redress because the culprit was the Japan state. So what was being hankered for is an official apology from the Japanese state as a juridical person. Of course, the denial. With this, a lot of ultra-conservative Japanese came forth, really denying the comfort women and saying that they're nothing but wartime prostitutes. So denied coercion, and they said it was an activity for money. In December 1996, a Society of History Textbook Reform was organized by the conservatives. They wanted to exclude all comfort women's stories from Japanese textbooks. In 1998, the Japanese District Court issued an unfavorable ruling in the Filipino comfort women's individual compensation claims. From then on, in response to the denial, a women's tribunal in Japan's military sexual slavery was held in December 2000, and from 2000 to 2007, everything was in a stalemate. In 2007, Congressman Mike Honda of California reopened the debate on the comfort women by issuing a resolution for Japan's formal apology. In November of the same year, Canada and the Netherlands also issued their respective resolution urging the Japan state for a formal apology and a compensation. Okay, so now let me come to my subject, which is really the psychological impact among Filipino survivors. We talk about flight versus fight response. We all have this, right? We have the physiological mechanisms for this. But with the comfort women, these mechanisms were disrupted. In other words, the body was in a state of shock that they don't know this response of fight versus flight. In other words, they're always on a vigilant mode. You know, that the system has gone haywire. And most of them exhibited learned helplessness. It's like there's nothing else to look forward in this life. And then disconnect. They suffered from an existential disconnect. They didn't know who they were because identity formation is normal for all of us. You know, we go through it throughout our adolescence, early adulthood. We come to know who we are by how our parents formed us. But in their case, the parents were killed suddenly, the villages were destroyed. So the identity formation was disrupted. A key element in their psyche was questions of who they are, why are they still alive? You know, they were dealing with guilt. Could we have been better off if we died with our families and not survived the war? So these were ontological questions. And there was, as I mentioned earlier, an existential disconnect and a historical disconnect because their experience was denied any as part of history for 50 years. And then suffering. For them, they felt that their life was one big suffering without any relief. And they didn't know why their lives is one of replete with suffering. Just talking about the flight and biological mechanisms. So fearful reactions are triggered by anything that reminded them of war. For example, loud voices, firecrackers, men in uniform, guns, dark places. One comfort woman never went inside a movie house after the war because of the darkened place reminded her of the cave where she was kept, held. And Lola Fidencia also after the war, she was selling some food along the sidewalk, and she was accosted by a policeman with a gun, and she really freaked out. So there could be triggers in normal life. So these are some of the physiological responses: palpitations, rapid breathing, intermittent trembling. All these would come out by just with automatic recollections of war, without any triggers. Occasional nausea, numbing of body parts. So they were experiencing this for 50 years after the war. So they have headaches, they complained of hypertension, endocrine dysfunctions, and helplessness, passivity. Well, this lady now is familiar to you. She complained of experiencing flashbacks. Some of her colleagues were avoidance. They resorted to having 3 identities like Lola Renina. She would have 3 identities. So it was a form of dissociative disorder and avoidance. Hypervigilance, like any bombs can explode in any minute now. The sense of urgency. They also had that. Disconnected inner fragmentation, sense of not having a center, loss of identity. Of course, Martin Heidegger, if you recall, speaks about being in the world, meaning we develop in relation to other people and in relation to our environment. Remove the environment and the significant others, and it's very difficult to have your own identity. This is the oldest. This is Lola Agueda. She's about 97 now, Lola. So Lola Agueda has questions. I translated it. She said, "What have I done to deserve this suffering?" And so phenomenological existential. This is how it's defined. Why phenomenological? Because phenomenological approaches allows a person to just unravel without any preconceived notions on the part of the psychologist. So it veers away from the traditional one-person therapy, where the therapist is in control and supposedly the knowledgeable expert. Here, the psychologist does not pose herself as an expert, but as a journey, a co-traveler in life. And along the concept of a wounded healer. Maybe you'll have an idea why I said that later. So the existential approach was twinned with the phenomenological psychology because of the existential ontological questions which were plaguing them about their identities. And the therapeutic aim was to foster wholeness rather than meander through the unconscious, in Freudian terms. It's more of drawing out the survivor's ability to heal herself. And in this sense, this is where psychology sort of interfaces with human rights. Okay. Because with human rights, you talk about dignity, okay? And in this kind of whole psychology, you talk about personal agency, you know, becoming responsible for your own brokenness and for your own healing. It's just reviewing everything. Let's just go through these very fast. You're in the academy, so you're familiar with this. Should be. Okay, so French, Maurice Merleau-Ponty was a French philosopher who emphasized the role of our bodies in experiencing the world. I feel this was relevant because their bodies were violated against. So it's important that we reinstate the sense of being embodied persons.
You're still good on this side.
Oh,
Okay, it will come back.
yeah, this is a bit on the philosophical side, you know, the postmodernism, modernism debate, and we're saying phenomenological existential psychology, somewhere in between, because it emphasizes personal agency. Okay, just the activities that were done. I'll just rush through it because you're not anyways psych majors. Well, this is the Cartesian. We sort of contrasted that. Because if you follow Cartesian logic, then it's a psychologist versus the, you know, it's objective as subject object. We don't subscribe to that. I don't subscribe to that. It's really person-to-person interaction, encounter. Okay. Art, I did a garden imagery. It's like a diagnostic tool. I developed this as early as 1983. I use altered states of consciousness, mild trance. I put clients in a mild trance and then suggest to them that they envisage a garden, and after coming out and coming back to normal consciousness, I would ask them to draw. And I just mentioned it here because I used this with the comfort women. They couldn't really express their angst before. They would often break down. So what I did, I used altered states to relax them, and then used creative visualization of a garden. But you'll know that this is Juanita Hammock's drawing. I asked her to draw a garden, and she comes up with a room. When I asked her, she said there were alternating images of a garden, but the room had a stronger presence. And so I said, okay, fine, just draw whatever it is. And she drew it. You can see this garden depicts fear. There's just one color, and you can see that the lines are jagged like this. So if you put yourself in the general atmosphere, and then on the right side here, you can see that there's like a weapon. This is the room where she and her husband were living, and this is where the Japanese took her. So you see, this is her husband, and this is her. You can see that the lines of it has a startled positioning, like arms are outstretched, and also the legs. And the overall atmosphere is one of fear. So we used this, and she started really coming out and telling her story. Okay, like a breaking through. And then the next one is, the real name is Presentación Británico, and this is her drawing. You can see it looks very, you know, there's symmetry, there's balance. But if you look further, what you can see here are mirror images. See, there's a very subtle demarcation of a red line. So there's a woman in red. She's like a spectator to life. Okay, but there's also a woman in front with a mound. This is her wartime experience coming out in this picture. See, so perspectives are different. If you're looking at it from this and you see a garden, but if you view it from the perspective of the woman in red, she's a spectator. But the woman on the mound, see the face is undefined. She feels like she doesn't exist at all. So it's really an expression of her inner brokenness. This is Rosario. There she threw the Japanese soldiers, and the same positioning of having been startled is there. She said in the middle portion, the red and the yellow, these were bombs exploding. And see, this is interesting. She was pointing to this. She said that she wanted to symbolize how the gun was being poked at her and how she was scared at that very moment. Novena, she drew a tree, but if you look at her drawing, it's just a shrub, like a shrunken. There's a sense of shrunkenness and really drying out, and this reflects the state of her inner self. And again, she uses drawing to speak. This is the comfort woman who lost her entire family during the war. Okay, so therapy is restorative justice. I want to dwell on this for a while because you're law students, I was told. So here, restorative justice guarantees of non-repetition, restitution, compensation, and one thing missing is rehabilitation. In the fight for the women's rights, most of the groups were talking of compensation and a little bit on restitution. But I was doing, behind the scene, I was doing rehabilitation by doing counseling with them. And guarantees of non-repetition by campaigning, bringing their experience to the International Criminal Court for non-repetition of the same crime in future wars. And the question really that I want to pose is, in what way is restorative justice any help in the restoration of the survivor's dignity? I think I'll just leave the question with you. I would, well, this is my own take on the matter. To break the impasse, because there's an impasse now between the ultra-conservative Japanese and the survivors and their supporters, which include the governments of Canada, Netherlands, and the US. I think we need to open dialogues again, and it's also important that we understand the different contexts of victimization, and then there's also need for use of mediation. What I'm trying to say is, some of the activists were like hardliners. They embarrassed the Japanese government in every opportunity they could get. They would embarrass the Japanese government. They forgot one fact, that in Japan, honor is really upheld. Secondly, the emperor is given like a demigod status. So by embarrassing Japan and really talking nasty about the emperor, the human rights activists only serve to push the Japanese state into a hard line. So now they are denying the existence of the comfort women. They just say that these are wartime prostitutes. But what I'm trying to clarify here is that in the case of the comfort women, none were given compensation during the war. There was no logistical support to the comfort stations that were put up. They were criminal in nature. The primary purpose really was to subjugate the guerrilla fighters who happened to be their fathers, brothers, and neighbors in the community. And on that strength alone, I think the Filipino comfort women plight deserves a second look from the Japanese juridical state, the person, the culprit in this event. Just pictures. The plea for redress continues. See, this is the period when they just came out. And the lady up there, I went to see her just before she died.
I am going to shorten my remarks a bit because I know, one, that many of you I'm sure have questions for Lola Fidencia, Cristina, and Joy, and because we also have a reception that we can go to and continue discussion afterwards informally. And what I wanted to do in my remarks today is to shift our discussion away a little bit from the embodied experiences that have been so, I think, compellingly relayed to us by the previous speakers, and to think a little bit more about how we mobilize knowledge and testimonial in terms of the abstract ideals and the practices that stem from certain kinds of commitments to abstract ideals, be they human rights, social justice, national liberation, gender equality, or forms of nationalism. And I also want to look at a context where silence is not what's pervasive, but it's a representational power and the ubiquity of that. So from the perspective of North America, we're used to speaking about collective institutional military sexual violence, as well as individual acts of wartime rape, in terms of a silence that must be broken, as events that must be publicly discussed. The 50-plus years of silence of those women from the Philippines, Korea, China, Taiwan, and Netherlands, who the Japanese military placed in situations of forced sexual services soldiers, is indeed too long a silence. However, this is a silence that must be remembered that was largely encouraged and supported by the international community in the post-World War II period. Japan's defeat in the Pacific War, or what we normally call from this perspective World War II, resulted in 7 years of occupation by the United States and a new Japanese constitution, a constitution authored by the USA. In this period, Japan acquired a new role in Asia, moving from being the enemy of the Allied powers to an ally of capitalist countries and a military base in Asia. The Cold War thus has very much shaped and continues to shape the arenas in which women who suffered sexual violence at the hands of the Japanese Imperial Army can speak, the context in which they can be heard, and whether or not they can have an effective role at seeking apology and redress. In China, as we've already learned today, the system of Japanese military organized sexual service stations emerged following the rampant rape associated with the occupational violence in Nanjing in December of 1937. This is a moment of occupation that saw half the population, over 300,000 people, killed in a period of 6 weeks. The brutality of the Japanese occupation of China that actually began in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria and ended with Japanese surrender following the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this has not been forgotten by the Chinese state. Remembering the war is a paramount concern for the Chinese state. For this, we need to ask why and to what end. The success of the Chinese Communist Party in resisting Japanese forces and the centrality of this resistance to the CCP's support amongst Chinese peasants in the Civil War period means that suffering at the hands of the Japanese military is integrally part of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. Discussion about and representations of comfort women are integrated into PRC national identity and to expressions of nationalism. They are never forgotten in the Chinese context. But national identity and nationalism are not fixed. And so what we need to consider is how the knowledge that's circulated shapes realms of possibility for individual and social justice regarding military sexual violence in the PRC, the Asian arena, and internationally. One of the most visible ways that people in the PRC come to know about the Japanese occupation of China and sexual violence is through film. With the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, and during the first 3 decades of the Cold War period, that is until about the mid-1970s, the large majority of feature films produced in the PRC were set during the war years. These films drew on familiar tropes circulating in political, literary, and cultural works since the late 19th and early 20th centuries that used the rape of women in various ways. Most importantly, women were understood as mothers of the nation, making rape then a powerful symbolic act of subjugating and destroying the spirit of a nation, seeking liberation from colonialism, imperialism, and military occupation. Despite the brutality of war scenes in these movies, produced in the 1950s through 1970s, sexual violence always tends to occur off-screen. The films cut from the scene to scene so that the act of rape is not shown on screen, but implied by the actions, emotions, and plots for justice. My current research project that takes me into the rural areas of China to investigate rural film projection, and that I've been involved in over the last year or so, has brought to light for me a troubling new set of representational forms. So last October and then also last May and June, I spent a number of weeks going to various villages with film projection units and was watching what are just a lot of war films. This is the predominant form that is now being circulated, and it's a new state project to, in fact, make sure that each village sees one film per month. Some of these films are produced by Chinese state companies, others are joint productions with international companies, including films like Zhang Yimou's Flowers of War that starred Christian Bales. A month of watching these films in May and June was difficult and troubling. Vivid, extended scenes of violent attack, culminating in rape of Chinese women by Japanese soldiers, appear in almost all the films. These are films, it must be remembered, that are shown in public spaces. These are public spaces largely populated by older men and women and children. We may argue that such a historically accurate representation is necessary to ensure that this violence is not forgotten. But let us also think about the politics of dehumanization of the Japanese soldier, the reenactment of sexual violence for entertainment, and the voyeuristic gaze that operates in these films. Today, I want to talk a little bit about Flowers of War, because in a one-week period, I saw it three times, and because it is an international joint production. As such, it reminds us of the global complicity and what I might characterize as too much public presence, too much representational knowledge, too much presence and sort of discussion in the realm of representation in film. Also, we should remember that Flowers of War was China's entry for the Best Foreign Language Film for 2011 in the Oscars. It received critical acclaim in North America and Europe for dealing with so-called difficult issues and for Christian Bale's performance. Even though anyone who will view this film, I am sure, would agree it's clunky and unoriginal, the film traffics in Orientalist exoticization fueled by sexual tension between a white male and an Asian woman. And it's really about a white man watching and witnessing sexual violence perpetrated by Japanese men on Chinese women so that he can proceed to save Chinese women in a way that Chinese men never could. I had a clip, but I won't show it. You can all go on YouTube, the trailer's all there. What we see in the film is it's marked by extended long shots, cut with close-ups on faces, either contorted in pain and suffering or rendered empty of emotion as a mode of coping with the violence they experience or witness. But what's important about this film is that the close-ups are also part of a technique used by internationally recognized and proclaimed Chinese filmmaker Zhang Yimou that he uses to eroticize China in its association with suffering women. Throughout the film, desire is exuded and created in the relationship between Christian Bale's character and the lead woman, played by Chinese actress Nini, who is the head of a group of Chinese prostitutes who save schoolgirls from being taken by the Japanese army to a comfort station by substituting themselves for the younger virginal girls. Violent sexual acts, lingering camera shots of women who are a priori sexualized because they're engaged in sex work, and the gaze of Christian Bale's, the camera, and the audience create emotional responses. But to what end, and how does this version of Comfort Women shape what is possible for others seeking apology and reparations? Raising these questions, I suggest, is important if we were to understand Comfort Women as a social and political movement globally. It is important that we recognize that the Chinese state consistently remembers sexual violence in World War II. Yet this remembering currently contributes to a state legitimacy that is not rooted in socialist state building. Yes, the Chinese state claims legitimacy in part through a history of struggle against the Japanese and as champions of women's emancipation. But in the post-socialist moment, the legitimacy of the Chinese state, oh, here's my printing went all crazy, is fundamentally tied to economic development pursued through neoliberal models. In this context, anti-Japanese Chinese nationalism most often is mobilized by the Chinese state when domestic social disorder threatens. Speaking about sexual violence in China, then, is often a way of silencing other forms of criticism and protest. At the same time, it has set up a whole set of geopolitical relationships between China and Japan, such that other calls for apology from the Japanese state do not find an alliance with the Chinese state, but are rooted in complicated and messy histories in which the Chinese state's claims and insistence on an apology from the Japanese state cannot be heard by those who see themselves through a Cold War framework in which Chinese claims and their use of comfort women is always a priori different than what's happening elsewhere. This then is part of the context in which the Philippine and Korean-based movements must work. Moreover, what we see is that the intertwined economies of Asia, the complex histories and current trajectories of American occupation and colonialism, European imperialism, Cold War alliances, and military bases mean that the specific struggles of comfort women like Lola Fidencia are deeply embodied and personal, and at the same time, they are practices formed by very contested abstract ideals. I present these thoughts today because I think it's important to recognize that it is not enough to simply know about comfort women, to recognize the violence perpetrated on behalf of and with the consent of the Japanese Imperial Army. We must constantly ask ourselves how our own practices of knowing, bearing witness, educating, and discussing are situated within broader social, economic, political, and cultural norms. Silence, of course, is not the answer. But assuming an opposition between silence and speech, with speech posited as progress, is not the answer either. Rather, it is essential that we think critically about the function of silence and of speaking out in different times and places, and how our speech acts reproduce and challenge complex material processes. Thanks.